Welcome everyone to the last lecture in our fall 2020 University of Minnesota School of Architecture lecture series. This semester we had a really, really wonderful roster of people, and I think through the benefits of, this is one of the few benefits maybe of conducting everything over Zoom, we had a pretty robust schedule this semester. From Charles Davis, kind of kicking things off in September, to Teresa Huang, Jerome Hayford, Jermaine Barnes, and Shaheen Rubari, Sarah Zudi, and last but definitely not least, Mira Henry, who is joining us here today. And Mira's lecture was rescheduled from the spring when the pandemic kind of threw everything up into the air. So I'm really happy that she's able to join us this fall. So I will introduce Mira, then she'll give her talk, and if there are questions that people have that come up during the talk, certainly feel free to put those in the chat. I'll be kind of moderating the Q&A discussion at the end as in lectures past. So Mira Henry is a co-principal of Current Interests, a Los Angeles-based architectural design studio founded by Henry and Matthew Au. Their practice is grounded in a joy for material specificity, color relationships, which you see on beautiful display with Mira's bright red and beautiful green background, assembly details, and an engagement in critical cultural thinking. Mira's professional expertise is in the design and project management of residential construction and detailing, and in retail and restaurant interiors. In addition, she has collaborated on large-scale building programs, including an urban branch library and a corporate hotel. Mira is design faculty at Southern California Institute for Architecture at SciArc, where she coordinates a fantastic undergraduate, undergraduate design studios and a fantastic design immersion program, a summer program for local youth. The work from that was really incredible. I had the pleasure of being on the review for that over the summer. This semester, she is also leading an advanced studio at Princeton University, and next semester, she'll also be teaching at Harvard GSD. So she's doing the double studio 2 semesters in a row, so she's a superwoman. Her formal research and writing focus on architecture, race, and materiality. She is the recipient of the 2019 Architectural League Prize, the Henry Adams AIA Award, the Archiprix International Gold Medal. She has participated in numerous symposia, lectures, exhibitions, and reviews at institutions nationwide, including Harvard, Yale, and Princeton universities. Prior to teaching and forming her own practice, Mira worked as a lead designer and project manager for Talbot McLanahan Architecture, Office Da, and Monica Ponce de Leon Studio in New York. Mira holds a Bachelor in Art History from the University of Chicago and a Master of Architecture from UCLA. So everyone please join me in welcoming Mira.
Jennifer, thank you so much. It says, can everybody hear me? Great, thank you. I'm going to kind of get right into it, share my screen, but thank you so much for having me. It's such a pleasure. And Jennifer, and I are friends and supporters of each other's work and thinking. And so it's like a little bit, even though I don't know hardly any of you, it's a little bit like coming home, being welcomed by Jennifer. So thank you. All right, so I'm going to do my best to kind of go through some projects that we've worked on in the office and try and keep it to about 40 minutes so that we have some time to talk. I may have to skip through some things a little bit quickly. I'll probably kind of exchange the I and the we a little bit, because some of this work I've done kind of on my own, and some of it's work that I've done collectively with my partner Matthew Au. All of it though is sort of what we would describe as projects that are part of Current Interests. So that's a bit of a caveat. I've titled this lecture, so can everybody see? Everyone can see, Jennifer, you can see the screen, right?
Yep, looks great.
Cool. I title this lecture Collecting Layers, and you see there's a tableau of material. And this is an image that Matthew and I produced this summer when we were all in quarantine and not able to be in studio like normally. Summers are usually a very productive time for us, and our studio is a really kind of important space for making. We do a lot of physical making, physical mock-ups and models, and I'll show you some study models and some of that work as a point of reference. I think it's kind of nice to see it, particularly for students, to see kind of the kind of commitment to model making. But this was really, this idea of kind of collecting is also a sort of method and kind of framework, kind of conceptual framework for us as well. A way of bringing together our own kind of individual interests and kind of thinking about how they overlay on top of one another, ideas about histories, and things that are kind of clearly architectural and things that maybe fall a little bit outside of what we typically understand as architectural, and really thinking about how to bring those together in a space is in many ways a sort of one way of describing the way in which we work is through this idea of collecting. I'm just going to kind of skip through a couple of images of zoom-ins of this tableau, and this is really starting to look at what does it mean to collect for us. It means to kind of bring materials together rather loosely, to overlay materials, to hang things, to let things fall on top of one another. So the sort of rightness and rectitudinous, the kind of linear nature of idea making, and let's say forming of affinities is sort of supplanted by things that can kind of casually lay on top of one another, hang on top of one another, be supported by one another. So these are some images of many of which are physical models that we photographed, things we've printed and hung, all kind of brought into a kind of one kind of space. And it's meant to be sort of messy, and it's meant to be highly aesthetic, and it's meant to kind of bring kind of jog new ideas in this kind of excessive overlaying. And I want to kind of zoom in at this one moment, which is a moment kind of on the upper left of this particular tableau. And this tableau was made, this is a digital construction, but this tableau was made to really for a publication that we were working on over the summer. And all the sticky notes that you see here are actually now filled with text, but it was a way of producing a sort of writing through images and through collecting. And one of the first things we kind of conceptually hung up on the wall, so to speak, of this piece was this was an article from actually was over the summer, an article about some new work that Kerry James Marshall produced. Sorry, hold on one second. And this was he, like everybody, was in quarantine, but he's a painter. For those of you who may not know his work, he's a painter. He lives in Chicago, and he is sort of a master colorist, and he composes his work with incredible complexity. This was, and he's somebody who we look a lot. We has a sort of I don't know, this sort of rock in some of our kind of vocabulary when we think about what does it mean to really work at a level of expertise of bringing things together, storytelling, and as well as a sort of commitment to the material of working, let's say a sort of material specificity. And that could be many things. And it does mean many things for us when we work. Oftentimes it means the kind of the very nature of the kind of weight and material of the things we work on. And that can be digital constructions as well. I think we think of images also as material, kind of steeped in materiality. But Kerry James, this was a kind of incredible and a wonderful article actually about his work at the time. And there was a quote by the curator Helen Molesworth, who was describing, he's a bird watcher, and he's among many things, he is a bird watcher and painter and all these things. And she was talking about, and usually much of his paintings are all figural and really kind of unfold the sort of kind of a libertary space of kind of of Black life in the United States, and that this is very much a kind of a major thread in his work, as well as kind of breaking certain producing a rupture in a sort of painterly canon. But the quote that Helen Molesworth wrote, and she's a curator, and she wrote about him in describing him. She says that Gary James Marshall is a polymath, she says, and he thinks the world is filled with knowledge and all of it is available to him. And I think for me, and for Matthew certainly, I think this idea that the world is full of knowledge is extremely moving, and something that sort of guides us as we start to kind of form meaning in our work, both as a professional practice, as a practice of teaching, as a practice of writing, and as an aesthetic practice. So this idea that and in a way, it's a sort of a bit of a resistance to certain ideas that I think that may have been taught, and some I think certainly we were kind of taught that certain things are architectural ideas and certain things are not. And this is a resistance to that, to say that our senses and our experience in the world can bring us closer to forms of knowledge, and that in a way, as architects, we can bring that into the conversation of architecture. I'm going to show several projects. I'm going to pull out a kind of an old project because I think that it's important. I thought it would be nice to kind of pull it out of the archive, so to speak. It was the first project that I was actually commissioned to do by in 2015 by an institution, in this case, the University of Michigan Museum of Art, UMA, and it's kind of a low-res image, I'm sorry, but on the right is the original building. This is one of the first actual, University of Michigan Museum of Art was one of the oldest collections of art, university collections of art in the country from I think they began collecting in the 1850s. And then they built a new building on the left. And I was asked to show exhibit some work that I've been doing. So I was working, it was kind of early on in my own kind of academic career, and working on small models and images that had specific meaning. And I was asked to put together an exhibition of my work. And I was given this little gallery, which is, I think, can you see right here? I just annotated this little gallery that's is about 45 feet long. And it was basically narrow. It's just a wall. They gave me a wall and I could exhibit my work in the museum. So let me try and now erase that. So I, in terms of thinking about when and where meaning begins in a project, I think one of the things I did was I went there and I started to look at the way in which the museum as a context, in the context of that particular space and particular museum, the way in which work was displayed, and ways of thinking very specifically about the rooms of galleries. And I'd been working really on, at the time, working very exclusively on thinking about what does it mean to develop ideas about architecture that start from the interior, even from as narrow as like the interior of a corner of a room, and thinking about what would it mean to build an architecture out from that, which is very kind of myopic and very specific. But when I went to the museum, I was just thinking about looking at how the way that the kind of color was, each room was kind of coded in a particular color, and began to anticipate, we could say, from a speculative sense, we could think that the museum, the walls themselves would begin to anticipate the work, or we could say that the walls themselves were sort of culturally coded in terms of what was the work that was being displayed. So you see, like on the left, the Korean art collection was kind of this kind of dark, kind of purple, sort of Renaissance was this kind of light green, medieval, this kind of dark kind of burgundy red. The Greek was this kind of dark celadon blue, and then the modern contemporary art was all in white. And I began to think about what does it mean, like the paint color of a wall and a gallery, and what that could mean. I'm not going to belabor this too much because I kind of want to skip to really the things that are most important in the project, which was that the context itself mattered, the context of the museum mattered, and the way of thinking about how the background. Let's just say that from an architectural standpoint, we could think about architecture really existing as a sort of a background that is in some way already full of content and already kind of begins to almost anticipate that which inhabits it. So knowing that I had a really long room, wall, my 40-foot long wall, I kind of came up with a sort of prompt for myself in which I developed a sort of small interior room that I imagined would be the collection of all of the work that I wanted to show. And then I imagined kind of unfolding it like a panorama. And so it was effectively a very large scale one-to-one kind of wallpaper and a series of models that were kind of displayed in front of it, and as well as monitors that were displayed in front of it. All of which were sort of fit to the context of the very specific context of the museum itself in terms of reveals and baseboard details, et cetera. The project, though, I think becomes maybe more discursive as the project, once I produced the work and began to sit back and think about it in its context and as a way of beginning to sort of have a dialogue with what seemed to be a sort of quiet background condition. So on the left, you see a photograph of taken from an African gallery through the kind of main atrium space to this kind of my 40-foot wall in the balcony beyond. And on the right is a series of photographs of this wallpaper, and the wallpaper was produced. I kind of color matched the Korean art gallery space, and that particular purplish gray captivated me because it seemed to me a color that, of all the colors in the gallery, seemed to be a color that was hard to pinpoint. When I would go into the gallery, sometimes it would look purple, sometimes it would look brown, sometimes it would look gray, depending on the light. And I thought that was something. I think I'm always kind of in general. In our office, we're sort of interested in colors that produce a sort of fugitive quality that begin to kind of move depending on the light, depending on what's in front of it. So we could say that the background in some ways it begins to shift depending on the kind of atmosphere or what is in front of it, what is in the foreground. I worked on this with some students and this work, and one of the things that when we got our test print back, we began to paint it up, and I started taking photographs of it and it happened to be that one of the students was standing in front of it, and I took a picture of one of the students standing in front of it, and I realized that depending on who was in front of it, the color, because I was at that point, I wasn't shooting it with a DSLR, I was shooting it with my iPhone camera, was color balancing the colors so that depending on what kind of body and what tone of the body that was standing in front of it, the color of the wallpaper would shift dramatically. And this is one of those things that it's a sort of afterthought, a sort of postscript, right? A sort of postscript of a project. When you begin to understand, there's a certain, let's say, understanding of what a project is, where the meaning lies in a project, and then you maybe begin to document it, or then you begin to, like, something takes place and it begins to carry another meaning. And in this case, it felt like it sort of went full circle, a sort of sense that the kind of cultural codedness of the very paint colors of the galleries themselves seemed to me kind of echoed back in this moment in which the students stood in front of it, almost kind of like a kind of impersonating a sort of anthropological ritual of photographing a sort of a portrait or a profile of a human being. So it's really it's really just a point of fact that these 4 photographs were taken maybe a minute between one another. I mean, it was just like click, 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 click. And so there was no light change. It's just a question of the way that the tool itself, in this case, the color balancing of a camera, and how our tools of representation, our tools of construction, will produce certainly certain biases, and we know this in terms of the history of photography and history of printing of photography, a great deal of kind of cultural bias in the way that photography and a film was actually engineered for white skin, and it wasn't until quite a bit later in the history of photography that film was actually rebalanced, and it was in order to be able to capture darker tones. So this is sort of part of the history of image making that seems important in our minds, but is nonetheless just another layer of thinking about work. Another set of, let's say, I guess we could say portraits, in this case, kind of headshots of a series of houses. And I've taken, I don't know, maybe 60 photos or 60 of maybe 60 or 70 kind of these little headshots of houses. And these are all houses in my neighborhood in Los Angeles. I live in LA, I live in a neighborhood called Leimert Park. And Leimert Park was constructed developed in 1920s, late 1920s. And it was really designed as a community for kind of upwardly mobile white families. And so there's all, like in many neighborhoods in the 1920s, 30s, kind of racial covenants, meaning that if you were not white, you couldn't buy into this neighborhood. And the kind of history of this neighborhood is quite radical. And this is now, and for the last 70 years, has become a kind of very, very, very kind of predominantly Black neighborhood, and a neighborhood of great pride as kind of a center of Black space in LA. So these houses, though, this is a sort of lived history of kind of a way of describing a lived history of the neighborhood. But these houses are just beautiful, and these houses are also quite strange. And I began to, after my second child was born, I was walked in the neighborhood a lot, and I decided to begin to photograph these houses. And this is really not a project about photography per se, because I don't fancy myself a photographer, but really a way of beginning to document something that I was seeing, which is just an observation, which is that there's in what very small band, very kind of dense, there's kind of a density that was kind of built up along the facade of hedges and awnings and eaves and exterior shutters, interior shutters and bars and grates and window tinting and blinds and drapery and paint of all different shades, and cladding and extra cladding, and all these things begin to build up in a very narrow band along these houses, and they all have it, all in their own way. And there's incredible style in the way that this, what I would describe in a sort of an aesthetics of privacy, begins to emerge in this neighborhood. And one could maybe say that there's nothing particularly unusual about it. Like maybe you go to any neighborhood, Black, white, wherever, and see some of these things. That may be the case, but this neighborhood is present, and it's something about the kind of scale of these homes and the buildup of all these layers is incredibly compelling to me. And this is a photograph, kind of a comparison that I think about actually. One photograph on the left here is a photograph I took last year on Martin Luther King Day, and the way in which the kind of front picture window is being used on the right, the picture being used in the picture window. This is one of the first photographs that were a kind of a set of promotional photographs that were taken of the neighborhood in the late 1920s, and thinking about the kind of long history of this neighborhood, and how that can make more complex and more dense the way in which we understand even things like landscape along the front of a building, or the way that blinds are closed, or the way that windows are tinted. There's two texts that I think about a lot. The first is a text by Bell Hooks called Home Place, A Site of Resistance. And this is, Bell Hooks is a feminist writer, Black feminist writer, who's been writing since the 70s, and she's kind of influential for many generations of women, especially Black women, in thinking about kind of intersectionality between race and gender. But she talks about the role of the home and the role of the interior, and how the house is a site of kind of constructing one's own self, and subjecthood, especially when public life is, when the life of kind of the public is in some ways hostile. And then I also think about Diane Harris. Diane Harris wrote a really amazing book called Little White House, where she looks at and talks about kind of suburban houses from 1930s and 1950s, and really specifically how houses and suburban homes were kind of codified through a sort of an understood and codified in a way, and are kind of full of are highly kind of charged racially, and so in that way I think about how in this case the kind of house itself is a sort of is itself an intersection of these kind of multiple kind of histories of between Blackness and whiteness, kind of the domestic and public life, and all beginning kind of building up along that kind of front facade. There was a project I did in 2018 called Rough Coat. And this project was a project that I was asked to do for my own home institution, SciArc. We have a gallery, and every year a faculty member is asked to do a show. And the show is meant to be a sort of kind of bringing a sort of tour de force in some ways, a sort of like trying to express one's kind of extreme ideas, kind of extreme position in architectural thought. So it's a sort of high bar, and oftentimes the work that's brought in and displayed in the gallery is really slick, like super slick, and I wanted to figure out a way to carry some of the work that I've been doing and thinking about these small homes and thinking about this cladding and the sort of idea of the exterior being a sort of kind of tough yet beautiful layer that's kind of full of affect and full of color and full of texture, and full of meaning, and also does a job of protecting and producing privacy. I want to figure out ways of bringing some of that research into the kind of intimacy of an interior of a gallery. And so I put this pairing together. On the left is one of those little homes, and on the right is a painting by Kerry James Marshall. And this is an incredibly intimate painting, and it's a painting that I look at and think about a lot, of a woman in a room. And so in some ways they become sort of doubles of one another, sort of what is on the outside and what is on the inside, and the space of kind of darkness in this case. The Kerry James Marshall is a sort of master of not only color but also specifically rendering in the dark, and his palette and his ability to produce kind of a full range of detail in darkness is something that is kind of hard to under is so excellent. It's so excellent. It's hard to sort of express how excellent it is. But again, there's also a sort of another doubling that takes place here, and it's something that's at the heart of this project, Rough Coat, which is the relationship between softness and like the intimacy of like a bed covers and a bed, and the place of rest, and kind of improvisation, and the personal, which is the sort of bedroom, and then the exterior, which is doing quite different work. And so this project, Rough Coat, was really about trying to bring those things together. So it's kind of an odd thing. I was thinking about what does it mean? And I describe it as a facade scale blanket. What would it mean to take something like an interior, things that are carrying all the interior kind of tactility and that which is provisional, and that you can kind of change at will, and is sort of kind of related to your own skin. How do you bring that and push that through an idea about something as kind of tough and staid and kind of well worked as, let's say, an exterior facade? So Rough Coat is really about bringing those things together. So this is actually an 18 foot by 18 foot kind of panelized, quilted, sewn, snapped, surface that's draped over a frame, and it's quite loose and limp, and it can be opened and unopened. It's layered and sort of styled. And in the foreground and the background are these two beds that are also tufted and layered. These are all using sort of upholstery techniques. At the same time, are layered with materials, in this case, flexible stucco and elastomeric stucco. So a stucco that can be we actually sprayed on the stucco, so it's highly flexible. But this is a commercial grade stucco that oftentimes homes use, and it's actually a company up in the Northwest, where in high seismic areas where people want to have stucco in their homes, but when there's an earthquake, they don't want to have a crack. This is a kind of a stucco that can actually has a bit of flexibility. So I knew that I wanted to work on bringing this idea of this kind of flexible stucco. What would it mean? I want to kind of test its limits. So Rough Coat was kind of an kind of experiment in that. I want to show some pictures. Well, first of all, I would say this is what it looked like on the exterior of the gallery. Dear visitors, is a pretty easygoing show. Feel free to touch the blankets and lay on the beds. The show was really about a sort of welcome into a very specific kind of space. And the walls were painted all a very dark sort of charcoal brown, a brown that were much like that purple that from the Korean Art Gallery and at UMA, shifted and changed depending on the light and the context. And I'll show you some more photos of it so you can understand the way in which the colors really began to change depending on what was in front of it, and the way that the lighting was situated. But I think that it was one thing that's really important to say is that this work was could not have existed. The material itself, it couldn't have existed without a sort of preconditioning of its environment. So when we brought the work in before the walls were painted and before the lights were dimmed, the work didn't make any. It was like I wept a little bit. It was like it didn't make any sense. I had to actually condition the environment in order for the work to really be seen properly, which is a kind of to me is a deeply architectural question of how do you actually construct that environment for something to be seen. But I thought I would show, particularly because this is a sort of university environment and hopefully many students are on this, show a little bit of the backside of what it was like working on the project, and also just sort of recall some of the ways in which, in the case of the project I did for UMA, sort of the working environment as also a place of knowledge formation. So these are the students we again, at the beginning of this summer, I actually did not know what we were going to be working on. I knew that I wanted to work with upholstery foam. I knew I wanted to work with this elastomeric stucco, and I knew I wanted to make a building scale blanket. But that's all I knew. I didn't know whether or not I didn't know I was going to sew. I didn't know what kind of highly engineered German snaps that cost $2,000 for all the snaps include. We didn't know a lot of things. So we prototyped for the first 3 weeks of the summer with just a small group of 3 students. And it took us about 3 or 4 weeks to actually produce this effective prototype. And it was very uncomfortable. It felt very risky because we didn't know what we were making. I knew we wanted to make a panel that was a certain size. It was too big for one person to carry. And in some ways you needed 2 people to hold it. So there was an idea about the scale of the part requiring a certain amount of kind of collaboration, but this is some of the working space of once we had made our prototype, we took a couple of weeks off, and then we came back together and then we fabricated everything in the course of I think 2 weeks. We invented a way of kind of adding, developing how the stucco could actually be carried. Of course, in Los Angeles, there's a huge fashion industry, and it's right down this. It's where our school is, right in the center of a lot of that, and so it's very easy to access materials, which is one of the reasons why it's such a pleasure to work here, and something that is a kind of a pretty central part of the way that I think that we work in Current Interests. We rented an industrial scale sewing machine. The first time the school had seen a sewing machine, and I don't know when, maybe ever, which is kind of awesome. And there was kind of incredible care and humor and that came out of the process of working, because everything had to be done just so, and everyone participated and invented that very process. And I would say that for us, so there's some photos here, like these little tags that one of the students, who was kind of the project manager of the factory floor, so to speak, would tag the different stacks, touch my face, back on my back, 2 coats on my back, etc. But there was also a sort of sense that there was a kind of almost a closeness. There was almost implicit that everyone knew that was participating in the project that the work also like had a sort of bodily kind of quality that was kind of looked like chocolate, felt like skin. Like there was something about the work that kind of had a sort of a presence about it. And, you know, I would say that as a last note on this is that, you know, the work, the reason that it was really important that we were working in a way that was unknown for us was because I wanted to invent our own metrics of evaluating things. So we were working with things that had tolerances that we weren't really used to and weren't really comfortable with. Like, does it, like, when we brought this stuff, we were like, is this bad? This looks like horrible. Like, when we brought these things together, like, this fit looks bad. No, wait, but it's good. And so we had to step back and actually kind of come up with our own way of evaluating whether or not we liked it or not, whether or not it made sense or not, whether or not the sort of informalness or sort of casualness was something that that felt like it was a kind of an idea about non-normativity. Is this something that we want? Is this good? Is this good or is this not good? So a sort of abandoning of all the ways in which we usually sort of decide whether something is good or not was something that we were I personally, and because I would say this project was not like fully co-created. I was the kind of I developed this project, my students helped work, but it was the idea of all of us working together as a way of looking at the work together and being able to actually be in that kind of a bit vulnerable space of trying to figure out whether something was what made sense or not, and whether the tolerances were something that we felt comfortable or not was a real challenge. It was something that I was really looking for, particularly when working kind of with students and thinking about what does it mean to kind of challenge our own ideas about fit and about fitness, about rightness, and trying to kind of shirk certain ideas about that. And really let our own sort of kind of bodies also, and kind of our own bodies and our own kind of experiences help us understand what we wanted to produce. You know, it was incredible. A lot of care went into the production of this. And so when it came to photographing the work, I asked a really amazing photographer named Tia Thompson, who's a portrait photographer. I had an architectural photographer come in and took the photos, and they were very well lit and very beautiful and very kind of right. And yet they didn't feel like they made sense to me. And so so Tia came in and we actually had a series of sessions where I invited people who were friends. So not necessarily friends of mine, but I invited people who had like families to come in, friends to come in, and kind of be in the space. And the space was very, very much about a sort of a place of rest and a place of kind of strangeness. I would say it would be a misread to describe the work as just a space of comfort. It's not. It's a place there's a sort of roughness to it. I mean, obviously it's called Rough Coat. At the same time, it's also kind of, everything is also like super tactile and squishy, but also rough at the same time in terms of its surface. So there's a sort of a bit of a rub there, quite literally, of the kind of the nature of the space. But you know, this photograph here, you can understand the kind of space of green and the kind of atmosphere of green, the kind of atmosphere of purple and browns, depending on who's in front, what's in back, and kind of how the lighting is set, was something that we were tracking. I would say that the lighting we weren't putting colored lights in. It's just the way in which in this case the camera was picking up and balancing colors, which is something that really beautiful. You know, the project was very much about work and about being able to have a sort of agency and almost an imaginary of what it mean to produce a more agency, an idea about agency in our built environment, what it mean for a facade to be able to be manipulated like a hoodie. I mean, this is a sort of, you know, a sort of speculation really. and there's a playfulness about the work, obviously, and we quite literally hung out on the bars, and listened to music. And this was the way that we filled the gallery over the course of the 2 months that it was there. These are some of the students that produced the work, and some of the I love this photograph because it's quite intimate. I have about 5 more minutes, and I'm going to zip through one other project. This project is a very extensive project. It's a project in which we were asked to, we call this Silver House Studio. The silver is the house on the left, and it's the sort of existing building. And then an artist lived there, and he painted his house silver, and a sort of which is the primer coat of car, like a car primer silver, and is dope. It was so beautiful, and made this incredibly reflective surface on this little small bungalow in Los Angeles. And we were asked to basically rebuild a small garage that was in front of his house as a studio. So we were working on we're still working on this project. It's a sort of slow project, but I'll show you, kind of clip through it. I think that it really very much kind of rhymes with a lot of the work that the earlier work, and certainly Rough Coat, and the way of thinking about layers, way of thinking about sort of ideas about privacy, and then also sort of really recalls some of the work that of Kerry James Marshall and ways of working in the dark. So in this project, we built up a very kind of extensive palette of very dark colors. We called it black with a little bit of red, green with a little bit of red, green with a little bit of black, black with a little bit of red, green with a little bit, black with a little bit of red, green with a little bit of black. So like all of these kind of subtle tones in a dark palette. This is an existing building. This is the little silver house, and actually the artist had the front window, which is that sort of picture window, is he filled it in, and all of the life of of his house is on the other side. And so there was this kind of and you can see on the right here is the existing garage, which we were developing another kind of layer, and we ended up kind of really riffing off of this idea of the landscape that was kind of the building succumbed to landscape, and began to like think about what does it mean to this idea of the kind of blank picture window, or the blacked out picture window, or the tinted picture window. And some of that work, some of the ways in which we've been already kind of cataloging that in neighborhoods in LA, as well as houses that were kind of overgrown with landscape. So I'll kind of flip through some pictures of the model. It shows a sort of a museum quality model that we produced. We're actually asked to, this is right when I had been awarded the Architectural League Prize, and we decided this project, we were just beginning this project with the client, we decided to make a quite elaborate physical model as a way of really studying what would it mean to kind of build up this kind of very kind of heavy cladding. And these were designed as, and I'll show you, we have, I'll skip through this a little bit quickly. These are all kind of the plan studies. The project really exists at the level of the facade and the section, and a buildup of layers of shingles, an interior layer of insulation, which is maybe recalling a different kind of blanket. In this case, less the blanket of the interior that Kerry James Marshall that has over the bed, over the woman in the dark room, but a blanket in this case. This is the solar blankets that are tailored onto the different satellites and rovers that go up into space. This is the Jet Propulsion Lab here in Southern California. They have an incredible soft lab where they produce all of these blankets. And so we've been really kind of super interested in the amount of tailoring of these kinds of blankets, but also the ways in which this idea of the blanket does all this kind of badass work. It's like both like this space, like this kind of surface of intimacy, and also this thing that like can go out to space and like whatever, protect you from the sun, which is incredible. So really trying to flip the script a little bit on some of these things, that I'm thinking more and more about ideas about like, say, soft power. This is an interior shot of our model, and you can see the sort of echo of the kind of interior insulation blanket, which is silver and kind of seamed and quilted, and begins to sort of have a dialogue with the horizontal silver lap siding beyond. And then this is an exhibition where we were asked to actually produce work for an exhibition, in this case in a gallery at Princeton School of Architecture, and we decided to make some full-scale mock-ups. So much of our work comes from working on large-scale models and mock-ups, so we decided to work on some full-scale mock-ups of this house. So these are some photographs of that, and on the left you can see the shingles that are kind of hung, and you may begin to see some kind of slight color differences from the top layer and the bottom layer. They're quite subtle in photographs and quite palpable in person. These are some of the physical models. The left is like a mock-up model that we were working on, and this is just how we work. Like this, so much of my work is understood through model making. So like we make a model, we build layers on top of it, and then we start to think about what it means to develop it in a much higher resolution. So this is a sort of study model and a sort of final model that's in assembly. And there's a sort of care of thinking about working in the model scale. On the left is this idea of a structural frame with a kind of rough moment and then a kind of smooth moment that we kind of fabricated from painting, cladding and painting like our wood sticks with sandpaper, and so then thinking about what that would mean if you were to scale that up. And on the right is this idea of a kind of cladding or column cover that is kind of made out of foam, that cast foam that we constructed, and some photographs of making of the blanket. And this is on the left is that soft lab at the Jet Propulsion Lab, and it's to say that the blanket is a blanket. And it's about making. It's about somebody's literally sewing those blankets, and that's the case certainly in our office. This is Alma. Alma was helping sewing and stuffing our insulation blanket, which had straps and things that you could roll up like as if it were a curtain on the interior of the building. And some very close attention to the sort of glass and the window openings. This is a sort of full scale. This window is about 3 foot by 3 foot, and it's actually a sort of a single cast rubber gasket that we're inventing. That we thought, wouldn't it be amazing if the window was framed in rubber, and wouldn't it be amazing if that glass was also sort of mirrored glass? This is a photograph of a small piece of writing that we did on glass, and really thinking about the nature of the kind of history of surveillance and kind of policing that's embedded in, and as well as protection, and kind of and styling, the kind of bringing together this idea of styling and surveillance and policing all together in a sort of all together at the level of glass. So we're thinking about how glass is already kind of culturally coded and kind of conditions the body on one side or the other. And I'm going to kind of skip quite quickly now to this photograph, which is, I think that one of the things that was really rewarding in this particular project, rewarding will be when we get the building built, but along the way, and having the privilege of being able to have these mock-ups in this gallery, we were also asked if we want to do any programming for the show, and so of course we said yes, and we invited 2 people that we admire very much, James Welling, who's a photographer, and Mario Gooden, who's an architect and writer. And this is Mario and James talking, and we really wanted to think about what would it mean for the work, our own work, to really just be a background. This conversation was not about our own exhibition, but about their work. James Welling is really well known. He's a photographer really well known for working in color and kind of recoloring certain, say, architectural monuments that people know quite well. And Mario Gooden is known for many things, but one of the things that he had just finished was this incredible book called Dark Space, which I'm going to tell you the full title. architecture representation and Black identity. So this book was one of those things that kind of stopped my heart when I read it in full. It was like being in a desert and be drinking water for the first time in a very long time. It spoke so much about a sort of flipping the script on a lot of the kind of terms and terminologies and histories of architecture that I was taught. And in many ways, like this is one of many things that he wrote about was this woman, Amanzalee Meredith, who was a Black queer architect and designed many homes, and including her own home for her partner and her in Virginia. And so we really wanted to bring together kind of an unlikely pair and begin to have a conversation between these two people who actually didn't know each other, but they knew of each other. So it was a really nice, it was a like super beautiful conversation. It really began to kind of focus around what it would mean to color or recolor images, color or recolor the canon, and what is it? What are the vocabularies that would emerge from that? And then I'll end here, which is kind of a small contribution to this sort of effort. This is a piece that I wrote called Curly Crown, A Conversation in Movement. And I think Jennifer is going to provide this for some of her students for tomorrow. We can have a conversation about anything, but certainly this writing this piece. This was a piece where that I wrote with a friend of mine, and really thinking about one's own body in movement in the city, looking at buildings, and in this case, a particular building, and beginning to kind of uncover sort of history and recode its history. On the left is sort of a diptych of seeing this building, which now is full of paint and facture, and its resolution is in some ways kind of blurred. But when it was first constructed, was really coming out of a kind of moment in LA history where there was a lot of sort of Mayan revival motifs in the ornament of a lot of buildings, comparing it to an architect who was very famous in LA at the time, Robert Stacey Judd, and his practice of dressing up in costume, and the sort of ways the kind of racialized kind of problematics embedded in certain architectural practices of ornament. And on the right, another diptych, a sort of new a new set of desires for me, thinking about what would it mean to kind of take back certain ideas about the ornament and to recode it through new imagery. In this case, a really beautiful painting by Ellen Gallagher, who paints wigs with clay on newsprint, and sort of a different kind of comparison of ornament and through a different lens. And I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mira. Thank you. Agreed. Beautiful and inspiring work, says Jennifer Yost.
Thank you.
School. Wow.
Yeah, Kodak. Kodak. Exactly. It was a Kodak. I'm looking at the thing.
We're talking. I was trying to quick reference.
But Kodak Gold. I'm not sure what year it was. Kodak Gold was the first film that was engineered for dark surfaces, and it came out of because a Mahogany Furniture Company and a Hershey's chocolate said that the cameras couldn't capture the color of their product. So, interesting facts.
So they had to do a new color card, not because of the people, but because of the objects. Very interesting. Mm-hmm. So, I have many questions that I can ask you, but I want to make sure that we open
I didn't cut you over time a little bit.
No. It's totally fine. The work was stunning, and I think the thing that is so fabulous is how you are embedded in material practice and really thinking these things through in such a kind of deliberative and thoughtful way with direct material. I actually wanted to dwell more on the details. I was like,
I know. I kind of assumed.
It's like, I want to see those drawings. But no, I mean, I loved how you talked about images as material too, and that you kind of, in some ways, recontextualize the work through like seeing them through the photograph. You describe it as writing through images. But I want to make sure if they're, normally people have been typing their questions and putting them in the chat, but I also encourage you, and it's a lot faster, to just say them out loud if you have a question. So
Or a comment. I'm pretty low key.
Hey, I have a question.
It really doesn't mean me much. Yeah.
yeah, Arseni, go for it.
I'm curious about this sort of like rise of the graphic, and does it relate to roughness and ambiguity and double meanings and multiple realities? How do you?
What do you mean by rise of the graphic?
To me, it seems like people are interested in graphic again recently.
Like in graphics or drawing or in layering graphics with physical space?
Yeah, layering graphics on physical space and creating sort of boundaries which are not clear, if that makes sense. Have you seen this develop, since you work with students over the years, would you say this is a thing that's happening, and why?
I mean, I would say maybe you're speaking of a sort of a general movement. You're talking about general movement, and you're seeing work that is kind of highly embedded in maybe the relationship between like image graphics and like physical things like are you describing like when like texture mapping going onto objects or things like that? Like, is that what you're sort of referring to, or are you referring to, tell me, can you?
Yeah, I think so. Like, for example, your project with the artist's home with the garage filled with vines, for example, where
Yes.
you don't know where the home ends and begins. And your project, I think, with the garage with the multiple claddings, which are sort of dark and become landscape. How do you understand this, or where does this, does this have to do with resistance on a large scale, maybe?
I guess to me, I mean, I definitely have I think you're right in terms of reading the shingles as a sort of landscape. I think you're accurate in describing that. And the shingles themselves are concrete. They're corrugated concrete, a standard corrugated concrete panel that we then dyed with pigment, so it kind of seeps into the material because it's kind of porous material, and then gave it a sort of finish coat, like a sort of a little bit of a sheen to it. And we, I think that there is, just speaking about the kind of, it's funny because when you describe graphic to me is almost like, it reminds me of something that's like hot and fast. And I think that our work, there are certain things that are hot and fast, but a lot of it, our work, it requires a little bit of like, it's like slow and deep, you know what I mean? And so maybe the word itself is a little bit confusing to me, but I think that, I mean, obviously there is a certain sort of like punch in like the use of like hot colors and stuff like that. But in terms of flatness and graphics as such, I don't necessarily associate our own work with that. But the way you describe to me, there are like effects, like surface effects of like, how do you reproduce, how could you ever produce an architecture that can somehow reproduce the kind of depth and texture of something like that hedge? It's nearly impossible. I mean, it's so deep and so complex and so rich. But I think that there are, and there's such a presence, right? There's still weight and presence. So I think maybe less the kind of idea of the graphics. It is like almost like the kind of the weight and I think you're right. That is the weight and texture of that hedge, of how do you actually build up a sort of tectonic doppelganger of that. For us, yeah, looking at not only like a system that's like a hung system, in which case these panels are actually hung on straps, or rather oftentimes these panels are bolted to like a purlin frame. We actually are like hanging them, so we have a proper underlaid frame because it's like a rain screen, so it's going on top. We hang it, but it's loose, so it actually isn't. It has a little bit of like weight to it, and also misregistration. So nothing is not like, it's not like tight, and that looseness and weight felt really important to us. And then working with this with the colors where they would like kind of seep into the concrete panel, so it almost as if the concrete was almost like an integral color, like almost like if you cut it you would see that dark all the way through. And I think that kind of depth and richness was in some ways also trying to vibe off of the kind of density and the kind of kind of like deep articulation of something like landscape, which is so kind of impossible to reproduce. One cannot, I mean, unless you can produce as a picture, right? But I think for us, what does it mean to translate some of those, so the presence of that into like a cladding system. So kind of all of those things are at play, as well as tinging it a little bit of colors, a little color. So it isn't something that seems like you can totally understand it in one look. Like it's kind of changed a bit.
Yeah, it's interesting you say, because I've looked at those photographs of the Princeton exhibition, and maybe it was just in my quickness of like consuming them in a digital format, not really dwelling on the kind of subtle differences in color between the panels. One of the things I appreciate so much about your work, and also the delivery of the work and presentations, you encourage a kind of deep looking, right? That like, we're going to dwell on the image. We're going to spend some time and careful observation. I think the photo series of these, seemingly quite modest houses, but have a lot of complexity to them, to this kind of shallow depth that you describe, is it sort of an extension of that? Got a couple of questions here from Jacob. Could you talk more about materiality in terms of the different uses, misuses of materials you work with? How has COVID, this online realm, shaped your thinking about materiality? For instance, the absence of touch or connection, maybe.
Yeah.
And I know this has really, affected your process of.
It really has really been like really hard. Really hard. It's really sucked a lot. I mean, I'm not coming from a place where like, well, now I know that I can simulate it instead. Like, no, it's just like, we got to wait this out, like I struggle with it a lot also in teaching, because so much of the kind of special knowledge that I have comes through working physically with things with students, and that's had to be like supplanted with like working digitally and working digital simulations, which is fine. It's just not, to me, it doesn't really do it for me. So talking about in terms of the different uses and misuses of materials. Yeah, okay. The material question though is such an important one. There's not one way to be an architect, and there's not one value set that I think is supposed to win. Like, I think that there's a lot of people who like to fight about like, oh, a project that is about, what's the future is this. It's like, I don't believe that. Like, I think that there's like many ways to be, and it truly, like, it really like deeply makes me really frustrated. Like, I know I'm not interested in a sort of like, what is the way forward? I think we're all moving in time, and we're all working in the way we're working, and this is a long game. This is all a really long game. To have a career in architecture and to be able to have the privilege of being able to leverage that in terms of being able to like teach and educate the next generations, it's like it is a long game. And I think that I'm interested in material, like the materiality of building things in the world that are physical, right? That's what I'm interested in. And not everybody's interested in that. Right? Other people are interested in other kind of spaces and sites for architectural ideation. So given that, and given the fact that we're working on trying to, also like hopefully build up a viable practice, that's also client-based to a degree, we're thinking about how do we keep the kind of like excitement for being like creating and exploring and not knowing, and the kind of it's not fun. It's like the kind of power of the creative power that you can engage in if in architecture to a certain degree. How do you keep that at the same time thinking about scaling? Like, how do you scale a project, right? And so for us, really thinking about materiality is thinking about also like building systems, thinking about how do you subcontract out certain things, how do you work on it on your own, what is bespoke versus that what is something that is attached to like systems out in the world. So like, for instance, us working right now on like these insulation blankets, like every house needs insulation, every building needs insulation, in fact, right? And so we're actually thinking about like, what would it mean to, maybe not everybody wants to like some weird insulation thing in their house, fair enough, but what we are like thinking about, what are the proper ways to insulate a building, and how can we kind of riff off of that in order to create something that is that we wouldn't necessarily have to hand sew ourselves in the future going forward, but we could actually understand the systems of production, same things, and be able to therefore imagine it in a life outside of our own sort of kind of small academic world. Same thing with like, for instance, the shingles. Like the shingles they are a product. They're not something that we hand cast, and so working with things that are also kind of typical. Like there's a lot of typical. We work a lot with ideas of the typical in terms of components and material, and it's really about like so it's not so much. It's the novelty comes in the kind of levels of specificity, not in necessarily the system itself. The systems are actually quite typical. It's just that we're just becoming super specific about the order or the way it's hung or the way it's painted or the way that it's layered or something like this. So materiality is also, it's also like a strategy for actually participating in like building construction, literally. In the world. So this is like the B side of it too. It's like right now we're working on a ceramic, on a terracotta tile kind of cladding project where been working with a terracotta tile manufacturer in Ohio. Like just working with the people who do the stuff is super gratifying, and that it's going to move towards can get bigger, be bigger than your own, bigger than yourself, and engage in the kind of economy of architecture, kind of the best version of, I think, the economy of architecture.
I love getting to hear a little bit. This is a really bad pun, and I put it in my head, and I stopped myself from saying it, but now I will say it, but peek behind the curtain. Just, thinking about, like the use of material and of construction, right? Like that, that like to get these things made out in the world, you have to engage with, the craft of the subcontractor. You have to engage with, like, it's not operating in this very like abstract space. It's like, no. These things are going to be made and be real and be out there. So how do we think deliberately about all aspects of that process? I think that's a really, really valuable lesson. And I am so sorry that we have to stop talking because our studio class starts in 6 minutes. But, I think your last comment about how do we not like kind of take things for granted, right? That like you might be working with something that's typical, but you're seeing it in a different way. you're thinking about it with such deliberateness in terms of its specificity of use and how you can tweak it, bespoke it, transform it, make us see it in a way that like we've never seen it before.
And also
That-
unpack its history, which is like
Right.
really like another whole other component. Like this idea that material, even a material practice in some ways like the material itself and some sort of isolated thing is just not true. It's like all of these, like for us thinking about ornament, like it's coming from this whole kind of legacy and history of ornament, like, and that becomes like dirty and messy and complex. And that's what it should be, as it should be. As it should be. We should have to hold all this and appreciate it for its aesthetics all at the same time. Like that is something that, I don't know, and it's kind of the high ambition, but to me, that's what to me is exciting about a material practice, is that it's deeply engaged in all of these aspects, both the kind of the tactile, the visceral, and also the kind of economy and histories in which it comes, in which it emerges.
Well, thank you so much, Mira. This is a really delightful talk. I always love anytime I get to talk with you, but this is
I know, it's
especially-
so nice.